On the 2nd of June 2010, a lone gunman embarked on a deadly killing spree that rocked the nation. Shooting many of his victims at close range, 52-year-old taxi driver Derrick Bird even murdered his own brother.
Bird's shooting spree effectively occupied only about 12 hours. And the impact was extraordinary because this was in the days, of course, of rolling news, of 24-hour news channels. As it unfolded, and as Bird became more and more obsessed by killing anybody who came across, so it became ever more dramatic.
Most of Bird's victims were completely random targets.
People delivering catalogues, people taking their shopping home, people just going about their day-to-day business. And I think it emphasises for me how fragile life is, especially when you encounter somebody like Derrick Bird, who has nothing to lose.
Derrick Bird killed 12 people, injured a further 11, and then turned the gun on himself. After his death, his family released a statement to the press via the local vicar.
He was a loving dad and recently became a grandfather. We would like to say that we do not know why our dad committed these horrific crimes. We are both mortified by the sad events.
This killer's story begins in 1957. Derrick and his twin brother were born on the 27th of November in Ennerdale Bridge, a village a few miles out of Whitehaven, to a seemingly ordinary family. The twins had an older brother, and their father worked nearby for the local council. The twins went to a school in Whitehaven. Despite being older by only 5 minutes, Derrick seemed to be in the shadow of his younger twin brother, David.
It's always assumed, isn't it, that twins will adore each other. You know, there are many twins that are like that, but in this particular case, I don't think they were. I think they were rather isolated from one another. David was probably the more likeable one, Derrick the quieter one. He was kind of a bit of a loner.
As the brothers grew up, the differences between them became more apparent.
David was his twin brother, but that was where any resemblance ended, I think. David was better at sports. He was on the rugby team at school. Derrick wasn't a particularly athletic child. David was cleverer, he was more handsome, he was more successful, and many people have described Derrick as living in David's shadow. And this isn't anything unusual. Many siblings are outshone by others in their family, but they don't carry the kind of rage and the kind of resentment that Derrick Bird did. I think because that was what his personality was. He really did catastrophize this relationship with his brother, and he blamed him for so many things.
Despite their differences, the twins shared their father's passion for hunting game. And just before his 17th birthday, Derrick was granted a shotgun license.
His father was involved in guns. In small towns in the countryside of England, owning weapons, especially a shotgun for hunting, is not unusual.
Bird's passion for guns continued into adulthood. Bird loved shooting. It was very much a solitary pursuit. He had very little in common with his fellow taxi drivers in Whitehaven. In February 2008, his taxi was vandalized and he suspected one of them.
There is often quite a bit of banter between taxi drivers, and sometimes this can turn quite nasty, especially when there are disputes over fares, whether somebody has picked up somebody else's passenger, because this is how these guys make their living. But for Derrick Bird, he attaches an awful lot of significance to this because he has this permanent exclusion narrative. Everybody is out to get me. Everybody is against me. And I think this does add to that.
Money was tight for Bird, and he became increasingly paranoid about it.
When Derrick Bird's father had died, there was an argument about the will and who was to get what in the will. Bird felt that his twin brother and the family solicitor were planning to reveal to the tax authorities who were examining Bird's affairs at that time that he had a secret bank account in which there was £60,000. He was convinced that the world, his brother, his solicitor, and every other taxi driver was against him. And then added on top of that, a little fuel that everyone was against him.
Bird also discovered that his father had lent his twin brother David money before he died.
Derrick found out that his father made an unspoken secret loan to David. Even at the point where he's the person, taking over and being responsible for the welfare of his mother, David is getting the money, feeling disinherited and believing, as he did, that his brother and his accountant were plotting against him to get him jailed for tax fraud were just too much for him.
He was of the view that his brother and his solicitor had conspired against him. He felt very bitter about a £25,000 loan that his father had made to his twin brother back in 1998. So this is somebody who really does hang on to grudges. He collects them, he stores them away. He doesn't deal with those issues with that anger, and it all boils and boils and boils away.
He was a man who was rapidly going nowhere, was finding himself alone. The frustration was simply too much for him.
Alienated from everyone and increasingly annoyed that his twin brother may have benefited from his father's death, Derrick Bird had finally had enough and came to a fateful decision. Full of rage and armed with his rifle, in the early hours of June the 2nd, he drove to his brother's house in Lamplugh.
Derrick Bird arrives in his brother David's house with his silenced .22 caliber rifle and confronts him sometime in the early hours. I can only imagine that brother would have been utterly bewildered. Suddenly his brother appears in the middle of the night, wakes him up. Bird proceeds, without any warning, to shoot his brother. Not once or twice, but 11 times in the head and the body.
This was a really, really cowardly act. He's caught his brother at the time when he's most vulnerable. It wasn't just an intention to kill, it was an intention to completely destroy. So shooting somebody 11 times, that's way more violence than you need to get the job done. So I think this does show the intensity of the resentment that Bird felt towards his brother.
For him, it was a cathartic release. Remember, this isn't just a brother from his point of view that cheated him out of some inheritance, late in life. This is a brother who was the person to whom he was compared for his whole life and compared unfavorably. So this was the final act of justice from his point of view.
Having shot his twin brother dead, Derrick Bird then left David's house and made his way to the home of 60-year-old Kevin Commons.
Just after 5 o'clock that morning, Derrick Bird drives to the house of his solicitor, Kevin Commons, and he hangs around waiting for him for around about 4 hours. So for me, this is really significant because it's showing that Bird has a rage that is not dissipating. I think when most people are angry and they don't have an outlet for that anger, it does fizzle away and people calm down, people feel better, but not Derrick Bird.
Several dog walkers saw Bird outside Kevin Commons' farmhouse in the village of Frissington. He waited there for several hours, planning his next deadly move.
Around about 10 o'clock that morning, Kevin Commons drives up his driveway, sees Derrick Bird blocking him in and probably wonders what on earth is going on. He's not given long to process that thinking until Bird comes out and shoots him twice. He must be absolutely shocked. What on earth is he doing? So he's just basically trying to survive at this point in time. He hasn't killed him. So he stumbles to his feet. He starts to crawl away, to go back towards his house.
A neighbour heard the gunshots and saw Kevin Commons trying to flee.
Bird follows him, but replaces the shotgun with the rifle and proceeds to shoot him twice more, killing him at the spot.
Just after 10 a.m., the concerned neighbours called the police, who discovered Kevin's body in his driveway. But Bird was nowhere to be seen. He'd fled the scene in his car, armed with 2 weapons, a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun and a .22 caliber rifle.
Shotguns and rifles are very different weapons. A rifle is designed to send a stable projectile a long distance. A shotgun is designed to spread pellets out. A rifle certainly can fire a small projectile that can kill you, but at short range, the mass of pellets can produce utterly devastating injuries. With greater range, less effective, but close up, a shotgun is far more deadly.
Derrick Bird had killed 2 innocent men, his twin brother David and 60-year-old family solicitor Kevin Commons. With no ammunition and his car damaged, he drove to a beauty spot near Boot called Dr. Bridge.
He'd run out of shotgun bullets, and suddenly he realized that, unlike his hyperbolic fantasies before this, life as he knew it was really over.
At approximately 12:30 p.m., police found Bird's car abandoned with one of his guns inside. Bird was now on foot, armed with his rifle. With the public still at high risk, the police had now taken the decision to name Derrick Bird as their prime suspect, but there was still no sign of him. Then, at approximately 1:30 p.m., police officers found Derrick Bird's body in a wooded area near Boot. He'd shot himself.
He'd engaged in the ultimate failure act. There was no reason for him to be here anymore.
He's got nothing left to lose at this point in time, and spree killers will often take their own lives, and what this represents is a way of taking back control. So they are the ones who are making the final decision on when it is they die. They don't want to go to prison. They don't want to have to face the consequences of their actions, so they take that very calculated decision to kill themselves.
Michael Ryan was born just 10 miles from Hungerford in Marlborough, Wiltshire, on the 18th of May 1960. His 55-year-old father, Alfred, was 20 years senior to Ryan's mother, Dorothy, who doted on their young son.
Michael was a bit of a mummy's boy. She really did pander to him and tended to insulate him quite a lot from the outside world. But I think in insulating him, she tended to isolate him a little bit as well. So he didn't really develop the skills of social interaction with his peers all that well.
Ryan was an only child who struggled to fit in with the other kids at school.
I think because he hadn't had those relationships with siblings that most children have, he found it difficult to relate to other people. So he didn't really make any connections with others at school. And I think he got a bit of a reputation as being the older one out, the slightly strange kid.
Age 16, Ryan left John O'Gaunt Secondary School and began his working career as a part-time handyman. His mother continued to dote on him, even as he grew older, reportedly buying him everything he wanted, including his first air rifle. He began a collection of firearms, which he kept on proud display in his room.
The Freudians would say that was a significant thing because of his own lack of masculinity and had to use a gun to confirm his own masculinity. Lived in a fantasy world of gun magazines and used to wear a strange kind of camouflage hat as though he was really Rambo. Some have speculated that he was spoiled, some that he was just overindulged. But there is no doubt that he turned into a tragic loner.
In 1985, 25-year-old Ryan lost his father to cancer and became even more withdrawn from the society around him. He immersed himself in his passion for guns, spending more and more time at the firing range.
Often when we look at spree killers, we look at what drives them. It's often an underlying simmering resentment that is often years in the making. And because they don't have those social connections with other people, they simmer away and they just get worse and worse, and they spend a lot of time on their own, ruminating and planning.
On the 19th of August 1987, the 27-year-old was unemployed and still living at home with his mother. The frustration simmering inside Michael Ryan was about to boil over.
No one can say whether he got out of bed that morning and decided, I think I'm going to shoot 16 people today, though there can be no doubt that he took out 2 semi-automatic rifles and a Beretta handgun, and by 12:30 had killed his first victim.
Ryan had loaded his car with guns and driven out to Savernake Forest, 7 miles west of Hungerford. 35-year-old Susan Godfrey was picnicking there with her 2 young children.
Ryan approached Susan Godfrey and her 2 children, instructed her at gunpoint to put her children into the car, then took her into the bushes in the forest and shot her 13 times in the back.
Ryan had callously and brutally committed his first murder.
Indeed, it was her children who subsequently first raised the alarm when they told a passerby, a man in black has shot our mummy.
Ryan continued with his bloody spree on Southview, shooting at passing cars. First he fired at a mother and her daughter, who managed to escape by driving away. Then he shot and killed driver George White and another neighbour, 84-year-old Abdul Khan, who was in the back garden of his home on Fairview Road.
He shoots at a neighbour, he shoots at an ambulance, which has also responded to the concept of shots fired. The man dissembling, disintegrating before your very eyes, falling apart, shooting at people entirely at random. And then, of all remarkable coincidences, his mother drives into the Southview.
Ryan's mother, Dorothy, arrived to a scene of complete devastation.
It's almost impossible to imagine what she must have thought. Her house is on fire, there are bodies in the road, her neighbours are dead, and there's her son carrying 2 rifles and a handgun, clearly having done something absolutely terrifying. His mother gets out of the car, puts her hands up, and pleads with him. Ryan shoots her, kills her.
It could be theorised that he accidentally shot his mother. I mean, if he was experiencing some kind of psychosis, some kind of mental health condition where he wasn't in control of his actions, he could well have just been targeting people randomly, people who appeared in his line of sight, and his mother happened to be one of those people.
As this scene of absolute tragedy and terror continued to unfold on Southview, Trevor Wainwright reported for duty at Hungerford Police Station.
It was quite bedlam, to be honest. In those days, we only had 2 phone lines into the police station, and there was a lot of movement. The first thing I wanted to know is who this was that was shooting people. Because, you know, I'd been at Hungerford as a bobby 15 years. I knew all the kids. I played football with them. I took them for football. And I had a wonderful relationship with people in the town. And this name, Michael Ryan, came out, and it didn't mean anything to me. I thought, well, who the hell's that?
At 1:30 p.m, the specially trained tactical firearms unit were brought in to support the local police.
You know, the adrenaline was running through me, and I knew what I wanted to do was to accompany the armed police when they arrived, because I was the local bobby, you know, and I thought, well, they didn't know where he was, you know, the location of him at that time. And so I said, well, I'll go down to the newsagents and get local maps and ordnance survey maps. I drove my car down into the high street, and I was amazed to see a row of ambulances, a PC who stopped the traffic, and a couple of fire engines, more police cars, and there was people sheltering in shop doorways. I just went straight into the newsagents. I said, let me have your street maps, let me have all the maps you've got. So I was able to get some, grabbed them, drove back to the police station, and by that time there was lots of senior police officers coming in and armed response vehicles that were coming in.
We knew something pretty serious was going on, but we didn't really know the scale of it. The telephone system was overwhelmed. I think it was very difficult for the police to find out where he was and what he'd done.
Even with the help of the maps, the police were struggling to locate Ryan.
At that time, there was conflicting reports as to his exact location because of the communication problem with the phones. Calls were coming in saying he was in one street, but of course he'd moved on by the time that call had been processed. So nobody knew where he was, but all the time he was shooting people as he went round the streets.
Ryan was on the move. After wounding another of his neighbours on Clark's Gardens, he'd headed back across Hungerford Common, where he murdered Francis Butler, a young father who was walking his dog. His 10th victim of the day was taxi driver Marcus Barnard, whom he gunned down on Bullpit Lane. But Ryan wasn't nearly finished. He was heading towards the heavily populated town centre. On Priory Avenue, he'd shot and injured 2 more people before heading north towards Fairview Road. Ryan continued south on Priory Road, now heading away from the town centre and towards his old school, John o' Gaunt. He shot at a family who were driving by in their car. 34-year-old father Ian Plale was hit in the neck and died. In less than 90 minutes, Ryan had killed 16 people.
Finally, Ryan, I think symbolically, returns to his old school, the John o' Gaunt Community College, and he locks himself in. By this time, the police have managed to assemble a reaction, and he begins to negotiate.
For 5 hours, the police tried convincing Ryan to give himself up.
He seems incredibly concerned about his mother. That seems to be what is at the forefront of his mind, what he's most concerned with. And you could interpret that as some kind of remorse, but actually I think it's more indicative of his enmeshment with his mother and his dependence upon his mother, because they had quite an intense relationship. He really was quite a mummy's boy, and I think the thought that he had killed her and taken her out of the equation was something that he was having quite a lot of trouble with.
Very near the end of the events at Hungerford that day, he said to the police negotiators, "Hungerford must be a bit of a mess by now. I wish I'd stayed in bed." And that, in a way, encapsulates the tragedy of him.
Shortly before 7 p.m, police heard a single shot emerge from the school.
The standoff ends with Ryan killing himself. The psychotic break is complete. He doesn't do anything dramatic. He simply shoots himself with one of his own rifles.
Sergeant Paul Brightwell of the Tactical Firearms Unit began a shouted conversation with him.
On many occasions, he seemed to me just to be on the verge of coming out. It wasn't until he said about the fact that he'd got 1 round of ammunition left. And I sort of said, well, why have you kept that one? And he said, it's obvious.
In a way, it was a sort of something of relief. Then it was over then, you know, he couldn't shoot anyone else, and in a way, it sort of was brought some closure in my mind. It didn't bring any closure to the events that happened subsequently, but it did bring closure to that event. He couldn't shoot anymore else, and no more lives would be lost.
Downs was having a relationship with a married man, a fellow colleague at the US Post Office where she worked.
Diane Downs said she was in love with this man. This was the man she wanted to be with. She thought that by eliminating the children, that would be the last hurdle she would have to jump over to be able to be with this man forever.
Downs had decided that he was the most important person in her life, bar none.
Here we've got a mother who relentlessly pursued her own wants and desires and really didn't care about her children.
I suspect she's a classic example of a narcissistic killer. The only thing she thinks about is herself. Her children exist in the world for her. She doesn't exist in the world for her children. And her life history suggests that is true. This was a way to change her life. This was a way to get a new boyfriend, the boyfriend she wanted. And that meant so much to her that it was more important to her than the life of her children.
This killer's story begins over 60 years ago. Diane Downs was born on August the 7th, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona.
You know, there's little to indicate that there was anything especially abnormal about her family life.
Her father was a postal worker and her mum was a stay-at-home mother. Her father was quite the disciplinarian. He had some quite strict rules. He would often give lectures to his children about how to behave, but it was very much a stereotypical American nuclear family.
As a teenager, Diane met Stephen Downs while in high school, and they became a couple. When she was 17, Diane enrolled in Bible college in Orange, California. But soon problems began to brew.
Diane had gone to Bible college, but that hadn't lasted very long. She was only there for 2 semesters, and she was kicked out of college because of, quote, her promiscuous behaviour. And that's a theme that we see throughout her life.
After her expulsion, Diane returned to her parents' home in Arizona and married Stephen Downs.
They got married when she was 18. Now, she was very quick to want to start a family, and they soon had their child.
Their first daughter, Christy, was born in October 1974. Just over a year later, Diane had her second child, a girl she named Cheryl.
Diane and her husband had 2 children together, and after this, her husband decides that's it, enough, our family's complete, and he goes and has a vasectomy. But Diane is absolutely adamant she wants another child, so she goes and has a short-term affair with another man and becomes pregnant with her son, Danny.
I suspect that she engaged in what I call instrumental sex. And what I mean by this is, for some women, sex is a tool. It's a weapon. They want to get pregnant because they believe that that will create a relationship.
Diane seemed to really enjoy the pregnancy stage of motherhood, but when the baby actually arrived, she didn't quite like that so much. There are lots of reports that she left the children alone, she left them unattended. When they got home from school, they were waiting on the porch for hours at a time.
In 1980, Diane and her husband Stephen divorced. Soon after, Downs was pregnant again. That's because she'd volunteered to be a surrogate mother.
At the time in the United States, there were approximately 100 surrogate mothers in the entire country. Now, those are the estimates at the time. So being a surrogate mom put you in a very rarefied piece of air. You were unique.
And she was actually interviewed for a national newspaper in the early 1980s, and she very much seemed to enjoy that experience. So she's got a taste of that limelight, and she will use her role as a woman, her role as a mother, as a way to get people to look at her.
The thing that we need to understand about these crimes is that because she's driving down the street with a loaded gun, which means before she stepped into that car, she knew she was going to kill her children.
In keeping with her pernicious plan, after leaving the farm, Diane Downs packed the children in the car and drove to a carefully chosen site on Old Mohawk Road. She pulled over and got out of the car.
We are talking about a premeditated homicide. This is something that the average person thinks of as inconceivable and impossible.
With the children not suspecting a thing, she went to the trunk of the car. She pulled out a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, walked back to the driver's side with the gun in hand.
When the children first see the gun, they have to be in total disbelief. It has to be inconsistent with all of their experiences.
Then she knelt on the seat, leaned forward towards her daughter, 7-year-old Cheryl, and from about 6 inches away, fired. On the case on the night of the attack was forensic expert Jim Pex.
One shot was in the back that exited about at the sternum, and that was probably the bullet that was found in the passenger side inside the vehicle.
As Cheryl tried to exit the car, her mother leant out of the passenger side door and fired again.
There was another shot in the lower torso here that stayed in her.
After the first bullet is fired, the second and third bullets are fired within seconds. When a gun is fired in a closed space like a car, it is very loud. I mean, it is booming, shocking, on its own is stunning, and for children more so.
Next, Downs shot her 3-year-old son in the back.
The boy was on the driver's side back seat, had a single wound, gunshot wound to the spine.
She then shot her daughter Christy in the chest twice. As the girl raised her hand to defend herself, a bullet ripped through the thumb of her left hand.
There was a bullet-penetrating wound that went through her hand, exited near the thumb, and then into her chest.
In the back of the car, Christy and Danny were clinging to life. Lying in the footwell in the front, Cheryl was mortally wounded.
I suspect that Diane Downs chose to shoot her children because it's placing distance mentally and physically between her and them. It's a cold, calculated decision. You don't have to be staring into somebody's eyes to do it.
It was a clinical and cruel attack, but Downs's evil plan was far from over. While her children lay dying, Diane Downs continued with her coldly conceived plan and covered her tracks.
Not only did she know she was going to kill her children, she knew that she was going to have to, in order to make it look like somebody else did it, she was going to have to shoot herself.
So she shot herself and
Jim Pex placed 2 .22 caliber bullets side by side under a comparison microscope. One ejected by Downs's rifle and the other one that was found inside the crime scene car.
What you have is a split image down the middle, and what we're looking at are extractor marks. And as you can see by the fine striations here, these extractor marks were both made by the same extractor, which means there is a relationship between the cartridge casings from the crime scene and the cartridges from her apartment. Then we knew that this is a breakthrough moment where there is a relationship to the fired casings that hit the children to the cartridges that were inside the tubular magazine of the rifle.
Checking sales records, police knew that Diane Downs had owned a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. After test firing one exhaustively, Jim Pex found similar extractor marks on the bullet casings. He concluded that a Ruger .22 caliber pistol was the murder weapon, but it was never found.
while Diane Downs managed to dispose of the gun, but at home she had a rifle that also shot .22 caliber rounds. And when the police processed this evidence, they found that they were the same manufacturer as the bullets that were used to shoot her children. They had ejector marks on them, some of them, that were the same as the ejector marks from the pistol.
The bullet casings and their telltale extractor marks were enough to convict Diane Downs for the murder and attempted murder of her 3 children. On February the 28th, 1984, 9 months after the crime, she was brought into custody.
When the arrest finally went down, I think the whole town breathed a sigh of relief.
She appeared at the Lane County Courthouse for her arraignment. After the charges were read, Diane Downs sprung a major surprise.
Her attorney stands up and, after he's finished all the legal arguments, says, "And besides, Your Honor, my client is pregnant and it would be bad for her health to go to jail." I was sitting in that courtroom in a seat. You could hear the entire room take a big, deep breath. It was stunning, just absolutely stunning.
According to rumors, the father was a local reporter.
There was one reporter that had sex with her, and I can tell you this, it wasn't me. And she became pregnant from that. But she loved the attention that she got.
By the time the trial began on May the 8th, 1984, Downs was 8 months pregnant.
Obviously, she was pregnant at the time of the trial, and this was something that I think she thought would help her garner quite a bit of sympathy.
Her antics, however, were not enough to fool the jury. A mountain of evidence went a long way to convincing them of Diane Downs' culpability in the crime. Then her surviving daughter, Christy, took to the stand.
This little girl had to have been under so much strain and stress. Her mother's tried to kill her. She's living with a new family. Her sister is dead. Her brother's in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And now she has to sit in front of a room full of strangers and talk about the most difficult night of her life.
She gets up on the stand, and when the person asks her the question, who shot you and your siblings, she says, my mum did it.
This was one of those moments in court where everything is dead still, nobody dares breathe.
Christy laid out how her mother first shot Cheryl, then turned and shot Danny in the back, then shot her twice in the chest.
The testimony just tore your heart apart. This wasn't the critical piece of information. There was lots of physical evidence of what Diane Downs had done. But I think this was essential in making sure that Diane Downs was convicted of the crime she committed.
On June the 17th, 1984, the jury found Diane Downs guilty of the murder of her 7-year-old daughter Cheryl and the attempted murder of her daughter Christy and son Danny. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. 10 days after she was found guilty, Diane gave birth to a baby girl. The child was immediately given up for adoption. At the same time, the prosecutor in the case, Fred Hughey, adopted the 2 children who survived their mother's attack.